The night air was cold and damp, pressing down like an invisible weight on the quiet stretch of road. A single streetlight flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows on the gravel below. Laughter echoed, harsh and biting, as three uniformed men stood around a tall, lean figure tied to a pole. Jamal Robinson's hands were bound behind him, the rough texture of the rope digging into his skin. His breath was steady, calm even, as he looked straight ahead, refusing to give the men the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort. "Man, this is too good," barked Sergeant O'Connor, his voice carrying a sneer that cut through the night. He was broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in a smirk, his badge gleaming under the dim light. "You thought you could just stroll through here like you belong? Like you're one of us?" He spat the words out as if they burned his tongue. Jamal said nothing, his silence a quiet rebellion against the jeers and taunts that circled him like vultures. O'Connor stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Oh, you're the quiet type, huh? Think that makes you tough? Let me tell you something. Around here, we decide who's tough." He leaned in, his breath warm and acrid. "And you? You're just another nobody who didn't know his place." The other officers snickered, their laughter bouncing off the surrounding trees. One of them, a wiry man with sharp features named Carter, circled Jamal, looking him up and down. "You know, Sarge, he's got that look," Carter said, chuckling. "The kind that thinks he's smarter than the rest of us. Bet he went to college or something." "College?" O'Connor scoffed. "A guy like this? Please, he's probably got a record longer than my arm." Jamal's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he kept his composure. He'd heard it all before, the assumptions, the stereotypes, the venom wrapped in mockery. This wasn't the first time he'd faced men like these. He knew better than to rise to their bait. O'Connor pulled out his flashlight, shining it directly into Jamal's face. "You're awfully quiet, friend. You scared, or just too dumb to realize what kind of trouble you're in?" Still, Jamal said nothing. His eyes didn't flinch from the light, steady and unyielding. For a brief moment, something flickered in O'Connor's gaze. Was it uncertainty? Annoyance? It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by his usual bluster. The third officer, a younger man named Evans, shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't said much, his laughter quieter and more nervous than the others. "Sarge, don't you think this is going a little far? I mean, he's not resisting or anything." O'Connor rounded on him, his expression hardening. "You going soft on me, Evans? Huh? This is how we keep order around here. You think people like him respect anything but force?" Evans muttered something under his breath and looked away, his shoulders slumping. "But Jamal watched the exchange silently, filing away every word, every gesture. He could feel the power dynamics at play, the cracks in their facade. He wasn't here by accident. Every moment, every decision, had led him to this exact spot. And while the ropes around his wrists might have bound his body, his spirit remained unshaken. O'Connor turned back to Jamal, his smirk returning. "You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight. Otherwise, who knows what might have happened to you out here. Ain't that right, boys?" The laughter erupted again, but it sounded forced, brittle. Jamal met O'Connor's gaze, his expression unreadable. There was a stillness about him, a quiet confidence that unsettled the men, though they couldn't quite place why. "You're awfully sure of yourself, aren't you?" O'Connor said, his tone darkening. "Let me tell you something, tough guy. Out here, we don't play by your rules. Out here, we make the rules." Jamal tilted his head slightly, his voice calm and measured when he finally spoke. "And how's that working out for you?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the bravado like a blade. For a moment, the laughter stopped. O'Connor's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" Jamal didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The weight of his words lingered, a quiet challenge that O'Connor couldn't ignore. The sergeant took a step closer, his fists clenching. "You think you're funny? You think this is some kind of game?" Jamal's gaze didn't waver. "No, Sergeant, but I think you're about to find out it's not." O'Connor stared at him, his face a mask of anger and confusion. Behind him, Carter shifted uneasily, glancing at Evans. The younger officer looked even more uncomfortable, his hand twitching near his belt. Before O'Connor could respond, the crackle of a radio broke the tension. A voice came through, calm but firm. "All units, report to the station immediately. Chief's orders." O'Connor grabbed his radio, irritation flashing across his face. "We're busy," he barked. The voice on the other end didn't waver. "Now, Sergeant, that's not a request." O'Connor cursed under his breath, his frustration palpable. He turned to Carter and Evans. "Cut him loose. Let's get out of here." Carter hesitated, glancing at Jamal before stepping forward to untie the ropes. Jamal didn't move, didn't flinch, as the ropes fell away. He rubbed his wrists briefly, his expression calm and unreadable. "You got lucky tonight," O'Connor said, his voice low and menacing. "But don't think this is over. Not by a long shot." Jamal didn't respond. He watched as the three officers climbed into their patrol car, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. As the taillights disappeared into the distance, Jamal stood alone under the flickering streetlight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder, stopping the recording with a quiet click. He looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. The night was still and silent once more, but something had shifted. This was only the beginning. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet street as Jamal Robinson parked his car outside a modest brick house. The porch light flickered faintly, fighting against the approaching twilight. Jamal sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. The neighborhood was familiar, a place he'd visited countless times growing up. Yet tonight, it felt different, heavier. He closed his eyes, letting the memories flood in. "Come on, Jamal. You're always too slow." Keisha's voice, bright and full of life, echoed in his mind. He could almost see her, a younger version of his sister, braids swinging as she darted down the sidewalk, her laughter carrying over the summer air. Back then, things felt simple. Back then, the world hadn't yet shown its cruel hand. Jamal sighed, opening his eyes. He grabbed his badge from the passenger seat, turning it over in his hand. The polished surface gleamed, the weight of it familiar but burdensome. It wasn't just a badge. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, fought for, and everything he had lost. The sound of the screen door creaking pulled him from his thoughts. Keisha stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "You planning on sitting there all night, or are you gonna come in?" she called, a teasing edge to her tone. Jamal smiled faintly, slipping the badge into his pocket as he stepped out of the car. As he approached, Keisha's smile softened. She reached out, pulling him into a hug. "It's good to see you, big brother." "Good to see you too, Keish," Jamal replied, his voice low but warm. They stepped inside, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. The walls were lined with photographs, family gatherings, childhood moments, and milestones. One photo caught Jamal's eye, a younger him in his first police uniform, standing tall and proud beside his mother. His mother's smile was wide, her eyes brimming with pride. Jamal felt a pang in his chest. "You okay?" Keisha asked, noticing his gaze. "Yeah," he said quickly, tearing his eyes away from the photo. "Just thinking." Keisha led him to the kitchen, where 2 mugs of tea sat waiting on the table. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Finally, Keisha broke the silence. "You've been through a lot, Jamal. More than anyone should have to. But you're still standing. I admire that." Jamal chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Admire me? Keish, you're the one out here fighting for justice every day, taking on cases nobody else will touch. If anything, I admire you." Keisha leaned forward, her gaze intense. "We're both fighting, Jamal. Just in different ways. But tell me the truth. What really brought you back here? What are you trying to do?" Jamal hesitated, the weight of her question settling heavily on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the moment that had changed everything. It had been a routine call, or at least that's what they thought. Jamal and his partner, Marcus, had responded to a domestic disturbance in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. The house was eerily quiet when they arrived, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They entered cautiously, their hands hovering near their holsters. Jamal could still hear Marcus's voice in his head, calm and steady. "You got my 6, right?" "Always," Jamal had replied. But what happened next was a blur. A figure darted from the shadows, a gun glinting in the dim light. Jamal had shouted a warning, but the sound of the gunshot drowned out his voice. Marcus went down, blood pooling beneath him as Jamal returned fire, his heart pounding in his chest. The aftermath was chaos, sirens wailing, flashing lights, and the suffocating weight of guilt that settled over Jamal like a shroud. Marcus didn't make it, and while the shooting was ruled justified, the whispers started almost immediately. They only put him on the force to fill a quota. Maybe if he'd been paying attention, his partner would still be alive. Jamal shook the memory away, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his mug. "I had to leave, Keish," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The city, the department, it was all too much. I felt like I was drowning." Keisha reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You didn't drown, Jamal. You survived. And you're here now. That has to mean something." Jamal looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "It does. I'm here because I can't let what happened to Marcus happen again. Not to anyone. This precinct, it's rotten, Keish. The kind of corruption that goes all the way to the top. They think they can get away with it because nobody's watching. But I'm watching. And I'm going to make sure they can't hide anymore." Keisha's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That's the Jamal I know. The one who never gives up, no matter how hard it gets." Jamal nodded, his resolve hardening. "This isn't just about me, Keish. It's about all the people who've been hurt, ignored, or forgotten. It's about justice." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling over them. Finally, Keisha spoke, her voice firm. "Whatever you need, Jamal. I'm with you. Always." Jamal felt a surge of gratitude, his chest tightening. "Thank you, Keish. That means more than you know." As the night wore on, they talked about their plans, their dreams, and the battles they knew were ahead. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something monumental, a storm that was about to break. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He had Keisha, he had his purpose, and he had a chance to make things right. As he left the house that night, the cool air biting at his skin, Jamal felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would be tough, filled with obstacles and enemies who would stop at nothing to maintain their power, but Jamal wasn't afraid. Because this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Marcus, for Keisha, for every person who had been silenced or oppressed. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The station buzzed with a lazy kind of energy, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Officers milled about, their conversations peppered with laughter and the occasional coarse joke. Jamal Robinson sat on the edge of a cold metal bench in the holding area, his wrists sore from the too tight cuffs they'd only just removed. He kept his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, even as he felt the weight of their eyes on him. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, but Jamal didn't flinch. Sergeant O'Connor strolled in, his swagger exaggerated, his smirk wide and self-assured. His boots clapped against the tiled floor as he approached, his presence commanding attention. Behind him, a few junior officers lingered, their postures uncertain, caught between admiration and unease. O'Connor's reputation preceded him, a man who ruled the station with bravado and an iron fist, masking incompetence with intimidation. "Well, look who's made himself at home," O'Connor drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. He stopped in front of Jamal, crossing his arms over his chest. "You comfortable, big guy? You want a pillow or something?" Jamal met his gaze without hesitation, his eyes steady, calm. "I'm fine, thanks." The simplicity of his response seemed to irritate O'Connor, who tilted his head, his smirk tightening. "Oh, you've got some manners on you. That's nice. You know, most of the guys we bring in here aren't so polite. Guess you're trying to impress me, huh?" Jamal didn't answer, letting the silence stretch between them. He knew men like O'Connor thrived on reactions, fear, anger, submission. Giving them nothing was the easiest way to shift the power dynamic. O'Connor's smirk faltered briefly, but he recovered quickly, turning to the other officers. "What do you think, boys? Think this guy knows how things work around here?" There were a few chuckles, though they lacked conviction. One of the younger officers, Evans, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between O'Connor and Jamal. Carter, the wiry, sharp-featured officer who had been part of the prank, grinned but didn't say much. "I think he's still figuring it out," Carter offered, his tone light but edged with malice. O'Connor laughed, slapping Carter on the back. "That's right. See, we like to keep things simple here, Robinson. You stay in line, you keep your mouth shut, and maybe, just maybe, you get to walk out of here without too much trouble. Sound fair?" Jamal raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Fair? Is that what you call this?" The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. O'Connor's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a glint of annoyance in his eyes. "You got something to say?" Jamal leaned back slightly, his movements deliberate, calculated. "I'm just wondering how often you guys use fair as an excuse to do whatever you want. It's interesting." O'Connor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his carefully curated image of control slipped. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you?" Jamal shrugged, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I've been told that before." The tension in the room was palpable now, the junior officers exchanging uneasy glances. O'Connor took a step closer, his voice dropping. "Let me tell you something, Robinson. Around here, respect isn't given. It's earned. And you haven't earned a damn thing." Jamal's eyes didn't waver. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air. Carter let out a nervous laugh, but even he seemed unsure of himself. Evans shifted again, his discomfort evident. O'Connor's face darkened, his temper threatening to boil over. He leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're clever, huh? You think you're going to walk in here and make a fool out of me?" Jamal's voice was calm, measured. "I don't have to do anything. You're doing a pretty good job of that yourself." For a split second, it looked like O'Connor might lose control entirely. his fists clenched at his sides, his face reddening. But then he straightened up, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're up against me." Jamal tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Guess we'll find out." O'Connor stared at him for a long moment before turning abruptly to the other officers. "Get him processed. Let him sit in the tank for a while. Maybe that'll teach him some respect." Carter moved to comply, but Evans hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio. Sarge, shouldn't we, check with the chief first, just to make sure everything's by the book?" O'Connor rounded on him, his glare sharp enough to cut. "By the book? Since when do we care about the damn book? You got a problem with how I'm running things, Evans?" Evans swallowed hard, shaking his head. "No, sir. I just thought it might be better to cover our bases." O'Connor scoffed, waving him off. "Grow a spine, kid. You're either with me or you're against me. And trust me, you don't want to be against me." Jamal watched the exchange closely, filing away every detail. O'Connor's overconfidence, Evans's hesitation, Carter's half-hearted support. It was all valuable information. Cracks were forming, and Jamal intended to widen them. As Carter led him toward the holding cell, Jamal glanced over his shoulder, his voice calm but pointed. "You might want to start thinking about who you're with, Evans, because sooner or later, the truth comes out. And when it does, being on the wrong side won't look so good." Evans froze, his face pale. O'Connor glared after Jamal, his jaw tightening. "Get him out of my sight," he barked. The cell door clanged shut behind Jamal, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. He sat on the cold bench, his mind racing. This was only the beginning, the first step in a much larger plan. He could feel the weight of the station pressing down on him, the corruption and rot that had festered here for years. But Jamal wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse before, and he'd come out stronger every time. This was no different. From his vantage point, he could see the edges of the station's operations, the officers moving about, the subtle power plays, the cracks in their unity. He knew it was only a matter of time before the facade crumbled entirely. And when it did, Jamal would be ready. The dim light of Jamal's office lamp cast a soft glow over the stack of folders spread out before him. He had waited until the station was nearly empty, the distant hum of a cleaning machine the only sound breaking the silence. It was risky, but this was the only time he could work without prying eyes. His fingers brushed over a faded manila folder labeled CLOSCDTAC, 17 to 146. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of what might be inside, before flipping it open. The first page hit him like a punch to the gut. A grainy black and white photo of a teenager, no older than 17, stared back at him. Beneath the picture was a name, Darnell Hayes. Jamal swallowed hard as he skimmed the summary. Darnell had been shot during a routine traffic stop 3 years ago. The report was sparse, filled with jargon designed to obscure rather than clarify. Suspect reached for waistband, it read. Officers responded with appropriate force, but something about the language felt too neat, too convenient. Jamal's hands tightened into fists as he read further. Witness statements had been omitted. No bodycam footage was logged, and at the bottom of the report, stamped in bold red letters, was the word justified. It was a word Jamal had come to loathe. It wasn't justice. It was a shield, a tool used to sweep lives under the rug. The fluorescent light above him flickered briefly, jolting him out of his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Darnell's face stayed with him, the weight of the boy's life now added to the mountain Jamal already carried. Memories of his own encounters with officers who saw his skin as a threat came flooding back, the way their hands hovered near their holsters, the way their eyes narrowed when he spoke too confidently. But Darnell didn't get the chance to walk away, and that wasn't something Jamal could ignore. He was still staring at the file when a soft knock on the door startled him. He snapped the folder shut, his heart racing. "Who is it?" The door creaked open and Sarah stepped inside. She was young, probably fresh out of the academy, with wide eyes that still held a glimmer of idealism. Jamal had noticed her hesitation during O'Connor's grandstanding, the way she lingered in the background, unsure whether to laugh along or stay silent. "Sorry to bother you," Sarah said, her voice low. "I just saw the light on and thought I'd check in." Jamal studied her for a moment, his guard up. "It's late," he said simply. "What do you need?" Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "I know I probably shouldn't say anything, but I've been noticing things around here." Jamal raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "What kind of things?" Her hands fidgeted nervously, like that report O'Connor filed last week about the guy we brought in after the protest, the one he said attacked him first. Jamal's expression didn't change, but inside, he felt a flicker of hope. "What about it?" Sarah hesitated again before continuing. "It's not true. I was there. The guy didn't do anything. He was just standing there with his hands up, and O'Connor." Her voice faltered, shame flickering in her eyes. "He hit him first. I didn't say anything at the time, but it's been bothering me." Jamal nodded slowly, his voice steady. "You did the right thing by telling me." She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't know what to do. Everyone here acts like this is normal, like it's just how things work, but it's not right." "No," Jamal agreed, his tone firm. "It's not." Sarah glanced down at the folder on his desk, curiosity flickering across her face. "What's that?" Jamal hesitated for a brief moment before sliding it toward her. "Take a look." She opened the folder cautiously, her eyes scanning the pages, her brow furrowed as she read, and when she looked up, there was fire in her gaze. "They got away with this." "They think they did," Jamal said quietly. Sarah's jaw tightened. "This has to stop." "It will," Jamal said, his voice calm but resolute. "But it's going to take time, and it's going to take people like you willing to stand up and say something when it counts." She nodded, determination hardening her features. "You can count on me." The door creaked again, and both of them froze. Jamal's heart pounded as he slid the folder back into the stack, masking his movements with the ease of someone who had spent years under scrutiny. The door opened fully, and Malik stepped inside, his camera bag slung over one shoulder. "You weren't kidding when you said this place was a mess," Malik said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Sarah looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. "Who's this?" "A friend," Jamal said simply. "Someone who's here to help." Malik gave her a quick nod. "Malik, local reporter. I've been trying to expose this place for years, but these guys are good at covering their tracks." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Malik dropped his bag onto the desk, pulling out a stack of papers. "I've got files, photos, interviews. Enough to paint a pretty ugly picture, but it's not enough to take them down completely." Jamal nodded, his mind already racing. "That's where we come in." Sarah frowned. "Wait, are you saying we're going to expose them? Like publicly?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jamal replied. Malik grinned. "Now we're talking." The three of them huddled together, their voices low as they planned their next steps. The risks were high, and the odds were stacked against them, but for the first time, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't fighting alone anymore. But even as they talked, a shadow loomed over their plans. Jamal could feel it. O'Connor's suspicion, the way his gaze lingered too long, the way his questions grew sharper. The man wasn't stupid, and Jamal knew it was only a matter of time before he started piecing things together. As Sarah and Malik left the room, Jamal leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He glanced at the stack of files on his desk, the weight of their contents pressing down on him. He was close, so close to exposing the truth, but he also knew that the closer he got, the more dangerous things would become. The station was quiet now, the hum of the cleaning machine long gone. Jamal sat in the dim light, his thoughts a whirlwind of plans and possibilities. He knew the risks, he knew the cost. But he also knew he couldn't stop now. The truth was coming, and nothing, not O'Connor, not the system, not the fear that clawed at the edges of his mind, could stop it. The sharp ring of Keisha's phone shattered the quiet of her office, her fingers freezing mid-type. She glanced at the screen, her pulse quickening when she saw the unknown number. For a moment, she hesitated, her instincts whispering warnings, but then she answered, "This is Keisha Robinson." A low chuckle came through the line, cold and dripping with malice. "Miss Robinson, I thought lawyers like you would know better than to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Keisha sat up straighter, her grip tightening on the phone. "Who is this?" she demanded, though the sinking feeling in her chest told her she already knew. "You're getting too close," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "Digging through files, making noise, talking to the wrong people. That's dangerous, Miss Robinson, especially for someone who's got so much to lose." Her stomach twisted, but she forced her voice to stay steady. "If this is about the precinct." "Oh, it's definitely about the precinct," the voice interrupted, sharper now. "And if you don't back off, well, accidents happen. Cars skid off the road. Offices mysteriously catch fire. You wouldn't want to put your family through that, would you?" Keisha's blood ran cold, but her defiance flared. "You think you can scare me into stopping? I'm not afraid of you." "Maybe you should be," the voice replied, and the line went dead. Keisha stared at the phone in her hand, her breath coming fast and shallow. For a moment, she was frozen, the weight of the threat pressing down on her like a physical force. But then she pushed herself to her feet, her determination hardening. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were wrong. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Across town, Jamal sat in his car, parked outside a dingy storage unit on the edge of the city. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, and he picked it up to see Keisha's name flashing on the screen. He answered immediately. "Keisha, what's wrong?" Her voice was steady but tight, the edges frayed with fear she was trying to mask. "I got a call, a threat. Someone's watching me, Jamal. They know what I've been doing." Jamal's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the phone. "Did they say who they were?" "No, but it's obvious. O'Connor or someone working with him. They're trying to scare me off." "They won't touch you," Jamal said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." "Jamal," she said, her voice softening, "I can take care of myself, but you need to be careful too. They'll come for you if they figure out what you're doing." "They won't get the chance," Jamal replied, his resolve like steel. "Stay somewhere safe tonight. I'll handle this." He hung up before she could argue, his mind already racing. He couldn't let this escalate any further. O'Connor was becoming desperate, and desperate men made dangerous moves. Jamal's eyes flicked to the duffel bag in the passenger seat, the contents of which could blow the lid off the entire precinct. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, photos, documents, recordings, and now he was close to finishing what he'd started. He stepped out of the car, the cool evening air biting at his skin, and approached the storage unit. The metal door creaked as he rolled it up, revealing rows of shelves stacked with old boxes and files. In the corner, beneath a tarp, was a locked chest. Jamal crouched down, his fingers working quickly to open it. Inside were more files, their edges worn from years of neglect, and a small flash drive labeled with nothing more than a date. He pocketed the drive and began sifting through the papers, his heart pounding with every discovery. One document detailed falsified incident reports, another listed payouts to silence victims' families. Each piece was a puzzle, and together, they painted a damning picture of the corruption festering within the precinct. Jamal's hands trembled slightly as he worked, the weight of what he was uncovering pressing heavily on him. A noise outside froze him in place, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. He quickly stuffed the files back into the chest, his instincts screaming at him to move. He peered through a small gap in the door, his heart lurching when he saw two figures approaching, their faces obscured in the fading light. One of them carried a flashlight, the beam sweeping over the ground as they neared. Jamal slipped the flash drive into his pocket and eased the door down, careful not to make a sound. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to get caught. Not now, not with everything he'd gathered. The voices outside grew louder. "I'm telling you, this is where he's been hiding stuff," one of them said, their tone agitated. "You better be right," the other replied. "O'Connor doesn't like being wrong." Jamal's pulse quickened. They were looking for him, or at least for the evidence he had. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a back door partially hidden behind a stack of crates. Moving quickly but silently, he made his way toward it, his movements precise and controlled. The door groaned slightly as he pushed it open, and he winced, glancing back to see if they'd heard. The voices paused, then grew more urgent. They were coming. Jamal slipped through the door and into the alley behind the storage unit. The shadows were deep here, the air heavy with the smell of oil and rust. He moved quickly, sticking close to the walls, his footsteps muffled by the dirt beneath his boots. Behind him, the sound of the storage unit door being forced open sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He ducked behind a stack of pallets, his breath coming fast and shallow. He could hear them inside now, their voices sharp and accusing. "Nothing here," one of them said. "Are you sure this is the right place?" "It has to be," the other snapped. "Keep looking." Jamal waited, every second stretching out like an eternity. His mind raced with contingency plans, each one more desperate than the last. But then, as the minutes ticked by, the voices began to fade. The men were moving away, their search leading them elsewhere. When he was certain they were gone, Jamal slipped out from his hiding spot and made his way back to his car. His hands shook as he started the engine, the weight of the flash drive in his pocket grounding him. He couldn't stop now. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was his resolve. As he drove away, his phone buzzed again. It was Keisha, her name lighting up the screen. Jamal answered, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I've got it," he said simply. "Whatever you're planning," Keisha replied, her voice firm. "Make sure you win. They don't fight fair, Jamal." "I know," he said quietly, "but neither do I." The meeting room was packed, a heavy tension filling the air like a storm about to break. Jamal stood at the front, his posture strong, his eyes steady. The officers who filled the room didn't know what was coming. They were talking, laughing, carrying on like any other regular day. But today wasn't like any other day. Jamal could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for, the moment he would reveal himself, not just as an officer, but as the new chief of police. His heart was steady, but a fire burned inside of him. They had tried to break him, humiliate him, undermine him, and now it was time for the truth to come out. "All right, everyone, settle down," came O'Connor's voice. harsh and commanding, cutting through the chatter. "We have some business to get through." O'Connor, standing at the head of the room, his arms crossed in a show of authority, looked around, eyes scanning his subordinates. He had no idea that today was the day everything would change. Jamal stood in the corner, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces that had either ignored his warnings or laughed at his presence. He knew them all, the officers who had built this culture of fear, who manipulated the system to suit their needs, who used their power to protect each other from accountability. He had watched them, heard their whispers, seen the evidence of their corruption. O'Connor turned his attention back to the room. "Now, we're here to discuss the new order from the board. A few changes are being made, and I'm sure you'll all appreciate them." He paused, his smirk stretching across his face. "But don't worry, things won't change too much. I'm still in charge." A low murmur rippled through the room, the officers nodding, some with eager smiles, others with apprehension. They were all waiting for O'Connor to give the orders, to dictate how things would continue as they always had. O'Connor turned toward Jamal, eyeing him for a moment. "Robinson," he said, his tone dismissive, "you can go ahead and take a seat at the back. Nothing to see here for you." Jamal's gaze never wavered as he stepped forward. The room fell silent. Jamal was always the quiet one, always overlooked, but now all eyes were on him. "Actually, Sergeant," Jamal said, his voice calm and measured but carrying an undeniable weight, "I'll be taking over this meeting." The shock was instantaneous. O'Connor's face turned a shade darker, his mouth opening and closing, unable to respond at first. There was a moment of pure disbelief, a flicker of confusion. He looked around the room, as if seeking validation, but the silence was deafening. "What the hell are you talking about?" O'Connor finally demanded, his voice rising in anger. "You're not." "I'm not just here, O'Connor," Jamal interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "I'm your new chief of police." A collective gasp swept through the room. Eyes widened, heads turned, and mouths hung open as the officers scrambled to process the news. O'Connor's arrogance had deflated in an instant, replaced with a storm of disbelief and fury. He shook his head, taking a step toward Jamal. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? Who do you think you are, Robinson?" Jamal stood tall, unfazed by O'Connor's challenge. "I think I'm the person who's going to expose everything you've been hiding." "Expose?" O'Connor sneered. "You think you can just walk in here, playing the hero, throwing around accusations? You don't know anything about how this place works." Jamal's eyes hardened. "Oh, I know. I've been watching. I've been gathering the evidence, and I'm not the only one who knows what's been going on here." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The officers were waiting for O'Connor to react, but it was Jamal who held the power now. "Robinson, you have no idea what you're dealing with." O'Connor spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just come in here and ruin everything we've built? You think you can change the system?" "System?" Jamal echoed, his voice sharp, his anger growing with every word. "The system you've built is one of corruption, racism, abuse. You've protected each other for years, covered up your tracks, and used your positions to hurt people who couldn't fight back." O'Connor's face twisted with rage, but Jamal didn't falter. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, slamming it onto the table. "You've been hiding this, haven't you?" Jamal said coldly, staring down at O'Connor. "Evidence of police brutality, fabricated reports, bribes, the kind of things you thought would never see the light of day." O'Connor's face drained of color. His eyes flicked toward the folder, then back to Jamal, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for it. "You think this is going to end well for you?" O'Connor demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with," Jamal replied, stepping closer. "And you're not going to intimidate me anymore." With a quick motion, Jamal flung the folder open, and the contents spilled out onto the table. Photographs, reports, testimonies. The proof was irrefutable. Jamal had gathered everything, every piece of evidence he needed to expose the corruption that had plagued the precinct for years. The officers around the table were stunned. Some shifted uneasily in their seats, others looked down, their faces unreadable. But the truth was laid bare. Jamal's eyes never left O'Connor's. "This is it," Jamal said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This is who you really are, O'Connor. A coward, a bully, someone who used his badge to hide his crimes. And today, you're going to face the consequences." O'Connor's mask of confidence crumbled, his desperation bubbling to the surface. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I've built this place. You can't just destroy everything I've worked for." "You didn't build anything, O'Connor," Jamal replied, his voice low and powerful. "You exploited it. You used your position to harm people who had no way to fight back. And now, it's time for that to end." The room was still. O'Connor stood there, trembling with rage and humiliation. For the first time, he had nothing left. No power, no control, nothing to hide behind. Jamal turned to the other officers. "You don't have to be a part of this anymore," he said, his tone softening slightly, but still strong. "There's a better way. You can stand up for what's right, or you can continue to let men like him destroy everything you've sworn to protect." One by one, the officers shifted, their discomfort growing as the weight of Jamal's words settled over them. O'Connor stood there, his jaw clenched, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you've won?" O'Connor sneered, taking a step back. "You'll never get away with this. There's always someone else pulling the strings. You think this is the end?" Jamal's eyes narrowed. "It is. It's the end of your reign, and the beginning of real change." With those final words, Jamal turned away from O'Connor, his head held high. He was no longer the overlooked officer, no longer the one they could bully or dismiss. He had taken back control, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been hurt by the system O'Connor had created. And as the officers slowly began to leave the room, some of them casting uncertain glances at Jamal, others looking guilty, Jamal felt a surge of hope. The fight wasn't over, but it had just shifted in his favor. The truth had won today, and Jamal knew that no matter what happened next, it was a victory they couldn't take back. O'Connor, however, stood frozen, his world crumbling around him, his own actions finally catching up to him in the worst possible way. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was defeated. The room emptied, and Jamal was left standing there, knowing this was just the beginning. The real work was about to begin, and he would make sure the system finally worked for everyone. The courthouse steps were lined with cameras, reporters jostling for the best angle, microphones raised high. It was a moment everyone had been waiting for, but no one could have predicted the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Jamal stood at the foot of the stairs, his hands in his pockets, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His eyes were fixed ahead, unwavering, but inside, a storm was brewing. "Are you ready for this?" Keisha's voice came from beside him. Jamal turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time in what felt like ages. The tension between them had been thick, a quiet strain. They had fought side by side for justice, but the last few weeks had tested them both in ways they hadn't expected. The stakes had become personal, far too personal. O'Connor had threatened everything Jamal held dear, using every tool at his disposal to keep his power, including targeting Keisha. But now that fight was coming to an end. He nodded, his jaw set, ready as I'll ever be. Keisha gave him a quick, tight smile, the kind of smile that said she understood more than words could explain. Together, they walked toward the courthouse doors, the weight of the world on their shoulders. Inside, the room was filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. Journalists typed rapidly on their laptops, the sound of fingers tapping keys almost drowned out by the murmur of whispers among the onlookers. Jamal could feel the eyes on him, each glance filled with either curiosity, disbelief, or suspicion. For so long, he had been the invisible officer, the quiet, overlooked figure who never made waves. But now, he was the one everyone was watching. The judge entered, and the room fell into a hush. Jamal's gaze flicked to the front, where O'Connor sat, his face tense, his usual arrogance replaced with an uncomfortable tightness in his jaw. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of scrutiny, let alone a trial. Jamal had made sure this day was coming. It wasn't just about taking down O'Connor, it was about everything the man represented. It was about showing the world that justice could prevail, no matter how powerful the enemy. Court is in session, the judge announced, his voice steady but carrying a sense of finality. The gavel struck, and the room was immediately filled with an air of solemnity. Jamal watched as O'Connor's defense team shifted in their seats, as if readying for the fight of their lives. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Matthews, who had worked tirelessly with Jamal to ensure that the evidence would be enough, stood at her podium. She cleared her throat, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor," she began, her gaze briefly meeting Jamal's. "The case before us today is not just about a rogue officer who used his badge to manipulate the system for his personal gain. It's about the system that allowed this to happen, the culture that empowered him, and the countless victims who suffered in silence." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger and hope surging through him. This wasn't just about O'Connor's crimes. This was about everything Jamal had fought for. The systemic abuse of power, the quiet suffering of so many, and the belief that things could be different. The prosecutor continued, laying out the evidence, files, photographs, recordings, each piece meticulously presented, each more damning than the last. Jamal didn't have to look at the screen to know what was on it. He knew it by heart. The falsified reports, the bribery, the intimidation. O'Connor had built his empire on lies, and today it was all coming down. As the prosecution wrapped up, Jamal stood up, his heart racing. It was time to make the final move. He stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had been through. "I was a part of this system," Jamal began, his eyes scanning the room. "I saw the way things worked. I saw the corruption, the abuse, and the lies. But I also saw the way the people who were supposed to protect us treated us, and I knew it had to change." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. There was a shift in the air, a quiet realization. "I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because justice was never an option in this precinct, not until now." Jamal turned to O'Connor, his voice growing stronger. "You thought you could get away with everything. You thought your badge would protect you, that your power would shield you from consequences. But it's over, O'Connor. You and your enablers are going to face what you've done." The room was silent, the eyes of the officers in the audience now fixed on O'Connor, who was visibly shaking. His face was pale, his arrogance replaced by fear. For the first time, he was no longer in control. O'Connor opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he just glared at Jamal, his eyes filled with a mix of hatred and disbelief. "You can't do this," O'Connor finally spat, his voice breaking. "You have no idea what you're up against." Jamal's gaze never wavered. "I do, and that's why I'm not backing down." With that, the judge called for a recess. The room emptied, but Jamal stayed where he was, his heart still racing. It wasn't over yet. The real work was about to begin. Later that night, as Jamal and Keisha stood together outside the courthouse, the weight of the day's events finally hit him. O'Connor and his team would face criminal charges. They would lose everything they had built, their reputation, their power, their freedom. But that wasn't the true victory. The true victory was what came next, the chance to rebuild, to create something better. Keisha wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it." Jamal closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her embrace ground him. He had fought for so long, endured so much, and now it felt like the first time in years that he could finally breathe. "It's just the beginning," he replied, pulling back slightly to look at her. "There's still work to do, but we're not doing it alone anymore." Keisha smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "No, we're not." Jamal looked out at the city, the skyline stretching before him. This was their city now. This was their time. The fight for justice, for change, was just beginning, and together they would see it through. Justice had been delivered, the system had been shaken, and now the real work of rebuilding could begin. Jamal knew there would be challenges ahead, that the road to true change was long and filled with obstacles. But with Keisha by his side, and with the support of the community, Jamal knew they could face anything. The city was theirs to rebuild, and nothing, not O'Connor, not the system, nothing, could stop them now. The precinct was eerily quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound that broke the stillness, a quiet reminder of the change that had swept through the building. The officers, who had once moved like cogs in a well-oiled machine, now shifted in uneasy silence, their eyes darting to the door as Jamal entered. As the new chief of police, he was a force they hadn't expected. A black man who had risen from the very system they had spent years manipulating. Jamal paused at the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room. The walls, once adorned with pictures of past leaders, now seemed to stare back at him like ghosts. He'd inherited a broken precinct, one built on lies, corruption, and fear. But that was about to change. "Let's get to work," he muttered to himself, pushing the door open. The officers around him shifted uncomfortably, unsure of their place in this new world. It was the first day of a new era. Jamal moved to his desk, the weight of the role pressing heavily on him. The paperwork, the files, the meetings, it was all overwhelming, but he had come this far. He was the one in charge now, and he wasn't going to back down. He called for a meeting, and within minutes, the officers filled the room, most of them looking hesitant, even guilty. They had no idea what to expect. Would he be like O'Connor, a tyrant who ruled with an iron fist? Or was he something else entirely? As the last officer entered, Jamal stood at the front, his hands resting on the desk, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to make friends," he began, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of every officer present. "I'm here to bring change, the kind of change this precinct needs if it's ever going to earn back the trust of the community." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. "You've all been complicit in something broken," Jamal continued, his voice unwavering. "But that ends today. We will have transparency, accountability. If you're here for anything less, then you won't be here for long." The room was silent, the tension thick, but Jamal stood tall, his gaze never faltering. He had made it clear. Things were different now. One by one, officers nodded, some reluctantly, others more confidently. But Jamal saw the change. Even if it was small, it was there. As the meeting wrapped up, Jamal stepped out of the room and walked down the hallway. He stopped at the bulletin board and scanned the names of the officers. His fingers hovered over the names of those who had betrayed him, those who had protected O'Connor and the system that kept them all in power. But he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel hatred. What he felt was resolve. He knew what he had to do. They all had to be held accountable. Weeks passed, and the reforms began to take shape. Body cameras were introduced, and the officers who had once turned a blind eye to corruption were now under the watchful eye of their new chief. Jamal worked tirelessly, his days filled with meetings, interviews, and long hours in the office. But it was all worth it. The changes he was making were already starting to ripple through the precinct, and not just the precinct, the entire town. It started small. The first community meeting was held in a modest church on the corner of Maple Street. The turnout was higher than expected, a mix of concerned citizens, local leaders, and even a few skeptical officers. Keisha and Malik stood by Jamal's side, guiding the conversation with grace and determination. "This," Keisha said, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd, "is the first step toward rebuilding the trust that's been broken. We're not just here to point fingers. We're here to listen, and we're here to heal." Malik stood next to her, nodding in agreement. This isn't just about reforming the police. It's about creating a partnership between the officers and the people they're sworn to protect. Jamal stood in the background, watching as his sister and his friends spoke with passion. He knew this was the beginning of something bigger than himself. The town's first community police advisory board was now a reality, and it would be led by Keisha and Malik, two people who understood the real work that needed to be done. The next few months were a blur of progress and setbacks, of breakthroughs and resistance. The community began to trust again, slowly at first, but the changes were undeniable. People started to feel safe. They started to feel heard, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal could see the light at the end of the tunnel. But even with all the progress, there were still moments when the past threatened to catch up to him. When he was at his desk late at night, the weight of the work pressing down on him, he would think of O'Connor and the others who had tried to destroy him. He would think of how they had laughed at him, humiliated him, tied him to that pole. But then he would think of the community, of the people who had supported him, of the changes he was making, and in those moments, he knew he was on the right path. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jamal found himself standing in front of his partner's grave. The headstone was simple but powerful, a quiet reminder of the sacrifice that had brought him to this point. He knelt down, his fingers brushing over the cold stone. "We did it, Marcus," Jamal whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not over, but we did it. I've kept my promise. I'll keep fighting for what we started." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around him. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over him. Marcus had been his partner, his friend, his brother, and he had paid the ultimate price for a cause that Jamal was still fighting for. "I won't let them forget," Jamal said, standing up and wiping away a single tear, "and I won't let you down." As Jamal turned to leave, he felt the weight of the community behind him. He felt the promise of a better future, the hope that had always been just beyond reach, now within grasp. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, there would be setbacks, and there would always be those who wanted to tear him down. But Jamal was no longer the man they could break. He was no longer the invisible officer, the one they could humiliate and ignore. He was the chief, and as he walked away from Marcus's grave, he knew this was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Jamal and Keisha worked tirelessly to bring the community and the police force together. Trust was built, slowly but surely, as conversations were had, barriers were broken, and real change took root. The precinct, once a symbol of corruption, became a beacon of hope, a place where justice was no longer just a word, but a living, breathing reality. The last scene, a quiet afternoon with Jamal sitting in his office, the sun filtering through the blinds, captured the essence of everything he had fought for. He sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his desk, the weight of his position still settling in, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Keisha entered, her smile genuine, her eyes bright. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. Jamal looked up at her, the room quiet, save for the soft hum of the lights overhead. "No," he replied with a smile, his voice full of conviction. "We did it." And together, they knew that no matter what came next, they had built something that would last, a legacy of hope, a legacy of justice.